This is the Chapter 7, Segment 1 outline, and Chapter 7 is consciousness. So that's our perception of what is going on in our minds. And especially the beginning of this chapter, this is not only a combination of psychological concepts, but also philosophical concepts, because it is difficult to assess consciousness. And one popular use of functional MRIs is to track consciousness. So in experiments, participants may be asked to view a screen which has natural scenes, and then the scientists will record activity using a functional MRI. Then they track the differences in cortical activity during the viewing of different pictures, and they can see distinctive brain activity. That is, brain imaging and computer modeling give researchers a window into the participant's mind. However, you may imagine that someday it might be possible to use brain imaging techniques to predict precisely what a person is seeing, and no one has been able to do this yet, and philosophers refer to this problem as the easy problem of consciousness, also known as the mind-body problem, which is the question of which particular pattern of brain activity underlies a particular conscious experience. And on the flip side of that coin, there is also the hard problem of consciousness. And related to that is qualia, which is the entirely subjective experience a person has with a perception. And how the book explains this is an experiment with color. So the hard problem goes beyond predicting from brain activity, what a person is seeing or thinking. The hard problem is to know what that person's subjective experience is like. For example, if you have a person look at a red screen, a scientist will be able to monitor their brain activity, but the color that we call red might be a different experience depending on the person, or qualia, for the participant rather than the scientist. So they may have a higher awareness of perception of redness, or they may associate an entirely different color with what we call red, and there is no way of knowing this. So basically, the hard problem of consciousness is the question of how brain processes result in our personal conscious experience. So another part of this that the book goes into is the brain's activity is similar whether we imagine something or actually see it. So several experiments indicate that the parts of the brain that are active when we imagine seeing something are the same parts that are activated by actually seeing that thing. And at least roughly the same brain regions are active when we imagine versus when we actually see something. And these results suggest that the reason we may have a similar experience when seeing an object versus imagining it is when we are imagining, we somehow activate the brain regions that underlie the actual experience. So our remarkable ability to recreate experiences in our brain suggests the question of what exactly is the function of consciousness. And although there is no definite answer, there is a very good possibility or a suggestion to our ability to imagine events. And consciousness offers a powerful tool for telling the future. So a person can conjure up a quote-unquote simulation or imagine what would happen as a result of a certain behavior versus another. And we can think of a complicated series of events running different simulations, allowing us to anticipate different consequences so that we can choose what to do. And even non-human animals, without the use of language, can also benefit from running a simulation in their mind, such as, will the predator chasing me be able to fit through the hole in this briar patch? So that's the example the book uses. Kind of imagining what will happen next. And this can be helpful in split-second decisions, and could help animals avoid predators and avoid dangerous situations by running scenarios. Another part of this is what's called our internal dialogue. So this is the words and sentences that pass through your mind as a form of self-talk or inner speech. And a question that is often presented is, consciousness limited to internal dialogue? What is consciousness without language? And to that, the book points to split brain patients. And a split brain patient is someone who has had a surgery that destroys the pathways of communications between these two cerebral hemispheres. So they have their corpus callosum cut, and this is the main band of axons communicating between the two cerebral hemispheres. So a psychologist called Roger Sperry was wondering what the effect of language would be on split brain patients, because language is controlled by the left cerebral hemisphere, but it only gets information from the right visual field. So he speculated that a split brain patient might be unable to see what objects appeared in the left visual field, and that a split brain person can talk to us only about what objects he sees in the right visual field. And after many experiments, which one in figure 7.5 the book highlights over, is a split brain patient is sat down and they are looking at a computer screen and presented with two objects. And they also have a series of cards that may or may not correlate to the objects they see on the screen. And they are asked to associate with what they see to the cards that are in front of them. So in the figure, they purposely will show two different scenes to the two hemispheres. So in the figure, the left hemisphere sees a chicken foot, while the right hemisphere sees a snowbound house. And the left talking hemisphere correctly will pick out a card depicting a chicken, while the right hemisphere correctly picks a card showing a snow shovel. Even though this person might not be able to articulate why they chose the snow shovel, it seems that there are two consciousnesses at work at all times in this split brain person. So if an experimenter asks the talking hemisphere why their left hand chose a snow shovel, a response most of the time will be, I don't know, or they may make up a response as to why their hand chose a snow shovel. And in a way, split brain patients show us how the verbal mind tries to explain what the other mind is doing, and sometimes this is done through confabulation, which is a filling in a gap in memory or understanding with a fabrication that the person believes to be true. Now, confabulation is not lying, and the person actually believes what he or she is saying, and the talking hemisphere is merely filling in the blanks and came up with some sort of plausible explanation as to why the left hand chose the shovel. And confabulation is also seen in people with memory problems and people who find themselves doing something they don't understand usually confabulate an explanation. And this is how the brain is trying to fill in the gaps of perception. And the last part of this section that talks about just specifically consciousness and going over base ideas is that we are not always aware of what our brain has decided to do. And this goes to the concept of free will, which is inevitably bound to the concept of consciousness. And free will is described as the power to make choices that are not constrained by supernatural, non-physical forces. Now, as the book explains, our brain shows activity before we are conscious of making a decision. So, a decision-making region is activated, then a motor cortex is activated, and then several seconds later, the subject has the conscious experience of making a choice before making the choice. So this brings into a factor of whether free will is illusionary, and we may not actually know the underlying processes or how we come to a decision, since our brain seems to be acting far sooner than when we are actually conscious of it. And the last little bit of this segment is talking about sleeps and dreams, and sleep has been a subject that is widely mentioned in many ancient texts. It's biblical, even in dream interpretation, seeing prophecies in dreams, and how vivid dreams, or how in reality many aspects of sleep remain a mystery. And the first section talks about how we have internal biological rhythms that enforce a sleep-wake cycle. So we have an internal biological clock, which is a biological mechanism that keeps track of time, and also a circadian rhythm, which is an animal's active rest cycle with a duration of about 1 day. So we have an internal clock that is supposed to coincide with light cues and light versus dark hours within our environment. And this is often why people who go on long trips or even during daylight savings time feel tired, because they are shifting their internally they have a biological clock that is running and keeping track of time, but man-made constructions are interfering with that internal rhythm.